Could we continue, please, with Dr. Sheryl Reiss, if you'd come to the podium, please, who will speak on Raphael, Pope Leo X, and Cardinal Giulio de Medici. This is an area that Dr. Reiss has worked on for many years, and we look forward to hearing what she has to say. Dr. Reiss comes from the University of Southern California, Los Angeles, so has made an even longer trip than Professor Borowski to come here. You're very welcome, and we're very interested to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
As with Professor Borowski, my thanks are due to Miguel Faramir for inviting me to this symposium, and to Juan Carlos Sanchez Acosta for his help with logistical matters, and to Paul Joannides and Tom Henry for organizing this wonderful exhibition. I should say that when I was first contacted by Dr. Faramir to speak on Raphael and Giulio, I hesitated, thinking that he meant Giulio Romano, whom I don't really work on, rather than Giulio de Medici, who will be the focus of my paper today. Writing in his diary under the date April 6, 1520, Marcantonio Michiel noted the untimely death of the Pittore Eccellente Raphael of Urbino and the resulting gran dolore of Pope Leo X and his court, imagined here in Pierre Nolasque Bergeret's painting from the Salon of 1806, which, following Vasari, shows Raphael's Transfiguration at the head of his deathbed. Leo, second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent de' Medici and a patron of great discernment, had commissioned Raphael in his workshop to execute an astonishing array of works in the Vatican and for export elsewhere. The Medici pontiff's memorable features are familiar from Raphael's magnificent group portrait of 1518, now in the Uffizi, in which Leo is flanked by Cardinal Luigi Rossi at the Pope's left, and to his right, the pontiff's first cousin and trusted braccio destro, or right-hand man, Giulio de Medici, the future Pope Clement VII. Born in May 1478, Giulio was the bastard and posthumous son of Lorenzo's brother Giuliano, who was brutally murdered in the Pazzi conspiracy. Giulio may have been raised as a child by the architect and woodcarver Antonio da Sangallo the Elder. If this is true, it would help to explain why he became what I've called a hands-on patron, with a remarkably practical temperament. He was a Maecenas who visited artist studios and building sites, wrote comments on drawings sent to him, expressed opinions on artistic issues, including color, style, iconography, the durability of materials, and he even recommended specific tools to be used by workmen. It was Cardinal Giulio who commissioned Raphael's Transfiguration, intended for the Cathedral of Narbonne in southwestern France, and painted in competition with Sebastiano del Piombo's Raising of Lazarus, at your right, for which Michelangelo provided drawings. Giulio, who became vice-chancellor of the church in 1517, was also the primary patron of Raphael's extraordinary all'antica villa on the Monte Mario, known today as the Villa Madama, which you see here. Cardinal Giulio de Medici's significance as patron was widely recognized. In 1518, the ambassador of another of Raphael's patrons, Duke Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara, wrote that the demands placed on the artist by Leo and the cardinal were, quote, not to be believed. And the following year, another agent of Alfonso's indicated that Raphael excused himself constantly because of his obligations to the pontiff and to the cardinal, saying that he could work for the Duke only when Cardinal Giulio was out of town. And on April 12, 1520, just 6 days after Raphael's death, Sebastiano wrote to Michelangelo in Florence, informing him, quote, that quel povero de Raffaello da Urbino è morto, and telling him that the late masters Garzoni were bragging that they wanted to paint the Sala di Costantino, seen here, in oils. Sebastiano then begged his friend and sometime collaborator to intervene on his behalf with Cardinal Giulio to gain the Vatican commission and warned Michelangelo that one of the Garzoni was on his way to Florence, and I quote, in order to have all the works in the Vatican palace from Monsignor Reverendissimo, that is Cardinal Giulio, who was then serving as the city's de facto ruler. Clearly, both Sebastiano and his competitors in Raphael's workshop believed that Cardinal Giulio carried considerable weight in the allocation of important commissions, and they were willing to go to great lengths to seek his favor. Raphael, consummate player of the patronage game during his lifetime, surely had known this as well. My paper this morning will consider what we know of Raphael's relationship with Cardinal Giulio de Medici and about this singular patron's place in the highly competitive ambience of the Leonine papal court. I am especially interested in what we might be able to surmise about Raphael's dealings with Cardinal Giulio based on his interactions with other artists, among them Sebastiano, Michelangelo, Giulio Romano, Giovanni da Udine, Baccio Bandinelli, and Benvenuto Cellini. Before turning specifically to Raphael, however, I would like to consider Cardinal Giulio and Leo X. In his Villa Julia Medica Versibus Fabricatum of March 1519, Francesco Sperullo characterized the relationship of the dedicatee, Cardinal Giulio, to his cousin, Leo X. And I quote, "He, Leo, father of the world, loving not as a brother your intelligence and your heart ripe for office, a brother none the less, controls the reins of the city through your agency, leaves you the burden of affairs, and handles and pacifies the globe under your labors. For himself, that is Leo, intent on sacred things, he delegates everything to you so that everything is accomplished to your command." End quote. Contemporaries commented often on the closeness of the cousins and on the pontiff's reliance on his younger relative for counsel, particularly after 1517. For example, in June 1520, a Venetian envoy wrote, "Cardinal de' Medici has great power with the Pope and is a man of great savviness who has utmost authority." And in July of the following year, Baldassare Castiglione wrote, "It seems certain that Medici is aware of the Pope's every intention." End quote. In the early modern period, cardinals played a critical role in the orchestration and implementation of papal commissions. Giulio de' Medici's patronage very much conformed to this pattern. He was, in effect, a papal nipote. An examination of his patronage during Leo's pontificate tells us much about individual and collective agency and about personal, familial, and curial identity. During Leo's pontificate, Giulio de' Medici's actions and motivations as a patron were, to a large extent, inextricably linked to those of his cousin. Thus, his patronage, until Leo's death in December of 1521, was shaped by his identity as a papal relative, as, in effect, a nipote. This raises the thorny problem of Giulio's specific role in undertakings that were, in many cases, ultimately Leonine in origin. Excuse me. In Florence, nearly all the projects that involved Cardinal Giulio from 1515 to 1521 had Leo as the primary or co-patron. During Leo's lifetime, Giulio operated as part of a hierarchical family structure with the pontiff at the apex. I think it can be safely said, however, that had Giulio de' Medici not been involved, what we think of as the Leonine contribution to the history of art, especially in the realm of architecture and especially in Florence with Michelangelo, would appear quite different. Cardinal Giulio's status vis-a-vis his cousin was often shown by the juxtaposition of their arms, as seen in this manuscript at your left of 1517, which, while dedicated to Cardinal Giulio, shows Leo's name, his onomastic lion, and the papal tiara. Similarly, Cardinal Giulio's hat is juxtaposed with a spectacular lion's head at your right in the stucco work at the Villa Madama. In the Battle of Ostia in the Stanza dell'Incendio, Cardinal Giulio accompanies the figure of the 9th century Pope Leo IV, who bears the features of Leo X, And at your right, and I go back and forth about this at your right, in Raphael's Transfiguration, Cardinal Giulio apparently appears in the guise of one of the patron saints of Narbonne, Eustace and Pastor, along with what may be, and this is to say at the very least, a highly idealized portrait of Leo X. And as I say, I do go back and forth on this. Along with images, words too proclaim Giulio de Medici's relationship to Leo, which was signaled by means of inscriptions found on buildings and on works of art. The now lost frame of Giulio Romano's stoning of St. Stephen, a cartoon of which is here in the exhibition, commissioned by Giulio's secretary Gian Matteo Ghiberti, was surmounted by the Medici papal arms and referred to Leo X and Cardinal Giulio as brothers. After Leo's death and Giulio de Medici's elevation to the papacy as Clement VII, works of art, texts, and inscriptions continued to emphasize his identity as Leo's kinsman and indicated that he was the Pope's sanctioned heir. At this point, I would like to turn to what we can glean of Raphael's relationships with Leo and Cardinal Giulio de Medici. Raphael's suave personality must surely have appealed to Leo X on many levels. In a well-known letter of October 15, 1520, Sebastiano del Piombo recounted to Michelangelo Leo's remark that Raphael had abandoned the style of Perugino upon seeing that of Michelangelo. The pontiff then said of Michelangelo, and I quote, "But he is terrible, as you see. One can't deal with him," end quote. The implication here, of course, is that Raphael, who had died 6 months earlier, was someone with whom to whom Leo could relate. Indeed, although later that same month in 1520, Leo is quoted as saying that he regarded Michelangelo almost as a brother and that they had been raised together, nourished together, Sebastiano admonished his friend, saying, "You frighten everyone, even popes," end quote. It is for this reason, I think, that Cardinal Giulio and his own agents took on much of the responsibility for dealing with Michelangelo on the San Lorenzo facade project and the new sacristy. Giulio, perhaps in contrast to Leo, was not intimidated by Michelangelo's terribilità. Instead, he sometimes took on the role of what we might call a hatchet man. It was he, acting on Leo's behalf, who terminated the facade commission in February or March of 1520, leaving Michelangelo seething. And it's important to remember this was shortly before Raphael's death, and Raphael was surely aware of this. In the case of Michelangelo, we are fortunate to have an extraordinary array of documentation to trace his sometimes fraught relationships with Leo X and Cardinal Giulio. For Raphael, the evidence is more elusive, and there's that word again about Raphael, and we can only regret the lack of similarly rich documentation of their dealings. Because we lack direct correspondence between Raphael and Cardinal Giulio, much of what we can say is based on evidence from what might be called the Sebastiano-Michelangelo camp. It is to be assumed, I think, that Raphael's more courtly and accommodating personality allowed him to avoid the sort of turmoil that often characterized Michelangelo's relationships with his patrons. As will be discussed below, I think it likely that a model of cooperative discussion prevailed. This is not to say, however, that Raphael did not attempt to undermine those who sought to challenge his supremacy in Leonine Rome and did not employ his relationship with Cardinal Giulio to do so. The commission for Raphael's Transfiguration and Sebastiano del Piombo's Raising of Lazarus provides insight into Cardinal Giulio's relations with Raphael and his competitors. Both artists petitioned the cardinal to advance their causes, particularly concerning the framing of Sebastiano's panel, as will be discussed below. The commission pitted the two artists against one another, with Michelangelo supplying drawings, as I mentioned earlier, for Sebastiano. Although the pictures were made for export to France, they were meant first to astonish the patron and a discerning Roman audience. Days after Raphael's death, the two paintings were displayed together in the Vatican. Cardinal Giulio was in Florence at that time. We first hear of the dual commission in a letter of January 19, 1517, in which Leonardo Salaio wrote to Michelangelo, and I quote, "Now it seems to me that Raphael is turning the world upside down so that Sebastiano does not do it," meaning his painting, "in order that they not be compared. Bastiano is suspicious." Salaio then asked Michelangelo to contact Cardinal Giulio's treasurer, Domenico Buoninsegni, quote, "so that nothing will be lacking for Sebastiano, because he is determined to do this in such a way that he will remain on the battlefield," end quote. Here we see the climate of rivalry and distrust among artists vying for patronage, and we see the cardinal's treasurer, Buoninsegni, as a conduit to the unnamed patron, who is, of course, Cardinal Giulio. In terms of Raphael's relationship with Cardinal Giulio, the most interesting events occurred in July of 1518. On the 2nd of that month, Sebastiano himself wrote to Michelangelo explaining that his painting was not yet done and that he did not want Raphael to see it before Raphael commenced work on his own panel, which was apparently as yet not begun. The Venetian painter then said about the cardinal, and I quote, "And thus our most reverend Lord, who has been to my place many times, has promised me, and I find him a man of most excellent judgment, just as you told me one time, something I never would have thought," end quote. Sebastiano, then, rather than lobbying exclusively through an intermediary, had voiced his concerns directly to the patron, who regularly viewed the progress of the painting. We must assume, I think, that when he was in Rome, the cardinal similarly viewed the progress of Raphael's Transfiguration. Sebastiano then asks Michelangelo to convince Buoninsegni, and by implication the cardinal, to have the panel framed in Rome because, I quote, "it would have more grazia embellished than nude," end quote. The impetus for Sebastiano's request, which sheds light on Renaissance attitudes toward the aesthetic importance of frames, is revealed in a subsequent letter to Michelangelo. The sender, Domenico da Terranuova, informed Michelangelo that Raphael was the source of the imbroglio over the framing of Sebastiano's panel, writing, and I quote, "Raphael himself has shown himself to be the master, the padrone of that deed, and he is lobbying as hard as he can with our most reverend lordship so that the framing is completed in France in order to defame Bastiano," end quote. Thus, it appears that Raphael was actively campaigning with the cardinal to have Sebastiano's painting framed in Narbonne so that it couldn't be compared by a sophisticated Roman audience under the best possible circumstances. Domenico da Terranuova then begged Michelangelo to convince Buoninsegni to intercede with Cardinal Giulio on Sebastiano's behalf to have the panel framed in Rome. In retaliation for Raphael's perceived perfidy, Sebastiano planned to tell Cardinal Giulio that Raphael robbed Leo X of at least 3 ducats a day. The Venetian painter won this round, and his picture was framed and gilded in Rome before it was dispatched to Narbonne. We lack documentation about how the patron reacted to the machinations of Sebastiano and Raphael. I suspect that the squabbles that broke out between Giulio Romano and Giovanni da Udine, who disagreed about the allocation of work at the Villa Madama after Raphael's death, might provide a clue. On June 4th, 1520, the cardinal wrote to his friend and overseer at the villa, Mario Maffei, expressing his bemused annoyance at the artist, whom he called those 2 madmen. The cardinal proposed to Maffei that Giovanni da Udine should do the stuccos of the garden loggia at your right, and that Giulio Romano should do the storie, or at least the drawings for them. And with a combination of irritation and amusement, the cardinal begged Maffei to, quote, "rid me of this nuisance." In a second letter to Maffei, written on June 17, 1520, Cardinal Giulio wrote, "We are pleased that those 2 harebrained painters are agreement and finally at work." Later in the letter, he says, "We laughed from our heart at the subterfuge you used to get those little paintbrushes to persuade them to do what they promised." Now, I like to think he had more respect for Raphael than that, but perhaps this does give us a bit of a clue of the cardinal's thoughts about artist squabbles. I would now like to consider the impact Giulio de Medici may have had on Raphael's Transfiguration. Sebastiano and other sources mention Cardinal Giulio's visits to artist studios, and we also know that he spent time at the building site of the Villa Madama. We know, moreover, that he inspected and commented on drawings by a number of other artists, including Michelangelo, Baccio Bandinelli, and Benvenuto Cellini. Indeed, on January 9, 1524, shortly after Giulio's elevation to the papacy, Leonardo Salaio advised Michelangelo, and I quote, "Always send drawings of what you are doing in order to please the Pope." The Albertina drawing seen in the present exhibition shows only Raphael's Christ Transfiguration on Mount Tabor, beneath the figure of God the Father, witnessed by two praying deacon saints. Konrad Oberhofer has previously suggested that this drawing at your left served as a modello to be shown to the patron. At some point, as seen at the Louvre sheet at your right, which is also in the exhibition, it was decided to include a representation of the apostles' failure to heal a demon-possessed boy while Christ appeared to Peter, John, and James. After Christ returned from Tabor, only he, the divine physician, could heal the lunatic child. It has been debated whether the modification of the subject matter was due to aesthetic considerations and thus the result of the artist's desire to make the scene more dramatic, or if it was an iconographic choice of the patrons alluding to Christ's healing powers and therefore to the family name, Medici, meaning physicians. In the case of the San Lorenzo facade, Cardinal Giulio sent very specific instructions about the figures to be represented, their locations on the facade, and whether they were to be seated or standing. For the Medici patron saints, Cosmas and Damian, the physicians, he said that they were to be shown as Medici perché furono Medici, because they were physicians. He was very concerned with this iconography. We also know that in August 1531, Clement examined Baccio Bandinelli's drawing for the pedestal of his copy of the Laocoon, at your right, as it appears now, rejecting the sculptor's idea for a bacchanal. So there is evidence for him being elsewhere, being deeply involved in iconographic and even visual choices. Given this patron's modus operandi on other occasions, then, I would suggest that the changes in iconography and composition were the result of discussions between patron that encompassed both the form and the content of the original proposal, seen in the Albertina sheet. Cardinal Giulio, of course, would have known what Sebastiano's composition looked like, and he, in fact, could have relayed such information about Sebastiano's composition to Raphael. In the final segment of my paper, I would like to turn to the Villa Madama. Leo had purchased the land by early June 1516, intending to build a loggia with 2 or 3 rooms. But by March 1519, the cost was estimated at a truly staggering 40,000 ducats. The evidence for Cardinal Giulio's role vis-a-vis Leo at Villa Madama is, at times, ambiguous. The best way to understand it is, I think, in terms of the property's dual function as papal hospitium, where visiting dignitaries could stay prior to ceremonial entry into Rome, and as a Medici villa suburbana. As Vice-Chancellor of the Church, Cardinal Giulio was responsible for what we would call foreign relations, and the villa's decorations extol the virtues of Leo's pontificate. That said, whereas for the roughly contemporary San Lorenzo facade project in Florence, Cardinal Giulio acted strictly as Leo's agent, beginning in 1518, the villa rising on Monte Mario was routinely described as the cardinal's undertaking, and he was certainly more than a mere front for Leo, as has sometimes been suggested as recently as a couple of years ago. Both the pontiff and his cousin went on various occasions to the villa, seen at your right, under construction in a detail from the battle at the Milvian Bridge in the Sala di Costantino. Documents suggest that it was used both for ceremonial and for more private functions, such as dinners among friends. In Sperullo's 1519 Villa Julia Medica, which we saw earlier, dedicated to Cardinal Giulio, the author lauds Raphael's art and genius and compares him repeatedly to Apelles. And I should say that Yvonne Alette of Vassar College, who is here in the audience, has completed an article on Sperullo's poem, which is forthcoming, and we should all be looking for that. Along with its fulsome praise for the Medici, Sperullo's poem describes varied aspects of the complex, including its favorable site and features such as its zixtus, fish pond, hippodrome, theaters, stables, and plantings, including citrus trees. Parts of the text seem to be based on, or in part to have inspired, Raphael's letter about the villa, a copy of which Philip Foster published in 1967. The precedence of the letter versus the poem has been debated, as has the letter's recipient. Based on Giulio de Medici's actions as a patron in other contexts, especially at San Lorenzo, I have suggested elsewhere that Raphael's letter may have been intended for Cardinal Giulio himself, or perhaps, and I think about this more often, for his overseer at the property, Mario Maffei, who had a great deal of architectural knowledge himself. At San Lorenzo, one sees Giulio's interest in details of siting, construction, measurements, convenience, and the quality and durability of materials. Similar concerns arise at the villa. Moreover, Raphael's letter dwells on fountains and waterworks, which are of great interest to Cardinal Giulio, who discussed them at length in his letters to Mario Maffei of June 1520, mentioned above. In 1526, a Venetian ambassador reported that one of Pope Clement VII's chief delights was to chat with ingegneri and to speak about waters. Once again, we lack direct correspondence between Raphael and his patron, and we can only lament that we have no record of the many conversations that surely took place about the great Vigna on Monte Mario. My final remarks about the Villa Madama concern what we might be able to surmise about the cardinal's role in its evolution. Once again, his practical, hands-on approach seen elsewhere suggests that he would have taken a deep and personal interest in this project. This is certainly the case with the letters written to Maffei from Florence shortly after Raphael's death, in which the cardinal addresses not only the allocation of the work on the loggia, which we heard about earlier, but also its iconography, the placement of fountains on the property, which the cardinal said specifically that he wanted to see for himself when he returned to Rome. Also provisions for the cleaning of the conduits and the waterworks, and the placement of antique statuary then in storage. His remarkable concern with detail is absolutely consonant with this behavior as a patron elsewhere. As mentioned above, we know that for the San Lorenzo facade, the new sacristy, and the Biblioteca Laurentiana, Giulio de Medici, as cardinal and as pope, examined drawings, commenting on them and inspiring Michelangelo's solutions, such as the stairway in the Ricetto of the Laurentiana. This was in part because of the long-distance nature of the patronage with Clement in Rome and Michelangelo in Florence, but it also suggests a patron who understood drawings and who felt them to be critical. They included not only what we think of as highly finished presentation or demonstration drawings, but also sketches of foundations, ground plans, tomb designs, and details of doors and windows. In the case of the Laurentian Library, a veritable stream of drawings flowed between Florence and Rome. And in a letter of 1526, we read that Clement had considered Michelangelo's drawings for a reliquary balcony at San Lorenzo, had made measurements himself, proposing detailed adjustments to it. The Pope is similarly described as studying measurements and commenting on a Bandinelli drawing in the early 1530s. Based on Giulio de Medici's dealings with other artists then, I think it very likely that he would have shown similar interest in the Villa Madama and that he would have looked at drawings like those seen here on the screen, discussing them personally with Raphael and with others involved in the project, including Antonio da Sangallo and Mario Maffei. In conclusion, we know that Giulio de Medici, Leo X's braccio destro, and one of Raphael's most significant patrons, was a demanding and deeply engaged Maecenas who wished to be informed about ideas and the progress of artists whom he commissioned at all stages. If, as I have suggested here, he considered and discussed with Raphael drawings for both the Transfiguration and the Villa Madama, this would provide further evidence of a creative process that relied on ideas proposed, developed, and refined by both artist and patron through verbal, written, and graphic means. It is my hope that by considering this possibility, we may come closer to understanding the genesis of some of Raphael's last and greatest works. Thank you. Gracias.